The alarm buzzed at 5:15 a.m., same as it did every morning for the past 3 years. David rolled over and hit the snooze button with the same tired motion he'd perfected. 5 more minutes. Just 5 more minutes of pretending the world could wait. But the world never waited. Especially not when you had a 7-year-old daughter counting on you. By 5:30, David was already dressed in his navy blue work uniform, the one with Lincoln Community Center stitched across the chest pocket. He moved quietly through their small apartment, trying not to wake Lily, who was still curled up in her twin bed surrounded by stuffed animals and picture books. The coffee maker gurgled to life as David packed Lily's lunch. Peanut butter and jelly again. He'd been promising to try something new, but grocery shopping felt like climbing a mountain these days. Between work, taking care of Lily, and keeping up with everything else, there wasn't much energy left for being creative with sandwiches. "Daddy?" Lily's sleepy voice came from the bedroom doorway. Her brown hair stuck up in every direction, and she clutched her favorite teddy bear against her chest. "Morning, sunshine," David said, forcing a smile that felt more genuine than it had in months. "You're up early today. I heard you making noise in the kitchen." She rubbed her eyes and shuffled toward him. "Are we going to your work again?" "Just for a little while before school, remember? Mrs. Patterson doesn't get to the center until 7, so you can do your homework in my office." Lily nodded. She'd gotten used to this routine. Most kids her age were probably still asleep in their warm beds. But Lily had learned to adapt. She'd learned to adapt to a lot of things since her mom got sick. David knelt down to Lily's level and smoothed down her messy hair. "Go get dressed, okay? I'll make you some toast." As Lily disappeared back into the bedroom, David leaned against the kitchen counter and took a sip of his coffee. It was bitter, but it would have to do. Everything would have to do these days. 3 years ago, David's biggest worry was whether his middle school students would remember to practice their scales. He'd been a music teacher at Roosevelt Elementary, and he loved every minute of it. Walking into the music room each morning, hearing the sound of kids attempting to play their recorders, watching their faces light up when they finally got a song right. It had been everything he'd dreamed of since college. But dreams had a way of changing when life got complicated. When Rebecca got diagnosed, everything shifted. The medical bills started piling up. David's teacher salary, which had felt perfectly fine for their little family, suddenly wasn't enough. They needed better health insurance, more stable hours, and the flexibility to take Rebecca to appointments without worrying about finding substitute teachers. The community center job had seemed like a temporary solution. Better benefits, steady pay, and David could bring Lily to work when needed. It was supposed to be just until Rebecca got better, until things went back to normal. But normal never came back. Now, David spent his days mopping floors instead of teaching melodies. He set up chairs for community meetings instead of arranging music stands for concerts. He fixed broken door handles instead of fixing kids' fingering techniques on the piano. The irony wasn't lost on him that he worked in a building filled with music. Every week, the community center hosted piano recitals, choir practices, and talent shows. David would arrive early to set up, and he'd hear people warming up, practicing their pieces, preparing for performances. Sometimes, late at night when he was cleaning up after events, David would find himself standing near the old grand piano in the main auditorium. His fingers would itch to touch the keys, to remember what it felt like to make music instead of just cleaning up after other people made it. But he never did. That part of his life felt locked away, like something that belonged to a different person. The David who taught music and played piano for his wife on Sunday mornings. That David had died along with Rebecca. "I'm ready, Daddy." Lily bounced back into the kitchen wearing her favorite purple dress and mismatched socks. She'd attempted to brush her hair, but several pieces still stuck out at odd angles. "You look beautiful," David said, and meant it. Lily had Rebecca's smile, the kind that could light up a whole room. "Come here, let me fix your hair." As David gently brushed out the tangles, Lily chattered about her upcoming school day. She had a spelling test, and her friend Katie was going to bring cupcakes for her birthday, and her teacher was going to read them a story about a magic tree. David listened, nodding at the right moments and making the appropriate impressed sounds. Lily's excitement about simple things like spelling tests and birthday cupcakes reminded him that not everything in the world was complicated. Some things could still be pure and joyful, even when everything else felt heavy. By 6:15, They were walking through the morning darkness toward David's beat-up Honda. The community center was only a 10-minute drive, but Lily always fell back asleep in the car. David would carry her into his small office, where she'd curl up on the old couch with her backpack as a pillow until it was time to get ready for school. The community center looked different in the early morning light. During the day, it buzzed with activity: seniors doing water aerobics, teenagers in drama club, families attending birthday parties in the rental rooms. But at dawn, it was peaceful, almost sacred in a way. David's office was tucked away behind the main auditorium, barely big enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, and that old couch where Lily napped. The walls were covered with maintenance schedules, event calendars, and a few of Lily's drawings that she'd made for him at school. As Lily settled onto the couch, David started his daily routine. Check the overnight emails. Review the setup requirements for today's events. Make his rounds through the building, ensuring everything was clean and ready. Today would be like every other day. He'd spend the morning preparing for a senior citizens luncheon, then help set up for an evening talent show rehearsal. He'd mop floors, arrange chairs, and test microphones. He'd smile politely at the performers and event organizers, staying invisible in the background while other people lived out their dreams on the stages he maintained. It was a good job, stable, reliable. It paid the bills and kept food on their table. But as David grabbed his cleaning supplies and headed toward the main auditorium, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was living someone else's life. Somewhere along the way, between the hospital visits and the bill payments and the late-night worry sessions, he'd forgotten who he used to be. He'd forgotten that he used to be someone who made music instead of just cleaning up after it. 3 weeks later, the community center was buzzing with excitement. The annual talent show was only 2 days away, and everyone seemed to have caught the performance fever. David had spent most of Wednesday morning setting up chairs in the main auditorium, arranging them in perfect rows while listening to snippets of rehearsals, echoing from the practice rooms. 10-year-old girl practicing violin in room B. Elderly man running through magic tricks in room C twin. Sisters working on a dance routine in the hallway because they needed more space to move. David found himself smiling as he worked. There was something infectious about watching people chase their dreams, even if his own felt buried so deep he'd forgotten where he'd left them. "David, thank goodness you're here," called Mrs. Rodriguez, the event coordinator, as she rushed into the auditorium clutching a clipboard and looking frazzled. "We've got the final dress rehearsal tonight at 7, and I just realized nobody checked the sound system since last month's choir concert." "I'll take care of it," David said, straightening up from the chair he'd been adjusting. "Microphones, piano, everything? You're a lifesaver. The performers are already nervous enough without technical difficulties." Mrs. Rodriguez glanced around the auditorium, mentally checking items off her list. "Oh, and can you make sure the stage is spotless? Some of the acts have white costumes, and you know how every speck of dust shows up under those lights." David nodded. He'd been doing this job long enough to know that the smallest details mattered most when people were putting themselves out there. A squeaky microphone or a dirty stage could throw off a performer's confidence, and confidence was usually the difference between a good show and a great one. By 6 o'clock, the auditorium was transformed. The chairs sat in perfect rows. The stage gleamed under the bright lights, and David had tested every microphone twice. The sound system hummed quietly, ready for whatever the evening would bring. The performers started arriving around 6:30, and David watched them from his usual spot in the back corner. Some looked confident, warming up with vocal exercises or running through their routines one last time. Others seemed nervous, fidgeting with their costumes or pacing back and forth behind the curtain. Lily sat in the front row, having convinced David to let her stay late to watch the rehearsal. She'd brought her homework and a bag of goldfish crackers, perfectly content to observe the organized chaos of a live show coming together. As the rehearsal began, David found himself getting caught up in the performances despite himself. A teenage boy played guitar and sang a song he'd written about his grandfather. A group of middle-aged women did a comedy sketch that had everyone laughing. A young mother performed a contemporary dance piece that told the story of her journey through MOT. Each act brought something different to the stage, but they all shared the same thing: the courage to stand up in front of people and share a piece of themselves. During the break between acts, David noticed something that made his stomach drop. The piano, the beautiful old grand piano that had been the centerpiece of the auditorium for over 20 years, sounded wrong. It wasn't dramatically out of tune, just enough to make anyone with a trained ear wince. The next performer, a college student named Jake, was supposed to play a classical piece, and David could tell from the boy's face that he'd noticed the problem too. Jake played through his song during rehearsal, but David could see him struggling. His fingers hit the right keys, but the music that came out wasn't quite right. The slight pitch differences threw off the harmonies and made the beautiful melody sound muddy and uncertain. After Jake's rehearsal, Mrs. Rodriguez looked worried. "The piano sounds off tonight. Do you think we should try to get it tuned before Friday?" "Piano tuners are expensive," David said automatically, then immediately felt guilty. It wasn't his money, and Jake deserved to have his moment shine. Maybe Jake could play something else, Mrs. Rodriguez suggested, but David could see the disappointment on the young man's face from across the room. As the rehearsal continued, David kept thinking about that piano. He'd walked past it thousands of times over the past 3 years, but he'd never really looked at it, not the way he used to look at pianos anyway. After the last performer finished and everyone started packing up, David found himself alone on the stage. Mrs. Rodriguez was in her office dealing with paperwork, and Lily had fallen asleep in her chair, exhausted from the excitement of the evening. David approached the piano slowly, like it might bite him. The bench was pushed back at an odd angle, and sheet music was scattered across the top. Someone had left a half-empty water bottle on the music stand, and there were fingerprints on the glossy black surface. Without really thinking about it, David sat down on the bench. His hands hovered over the keys for a moment, and he could feel his heart beating faster than it should. Just to check the tuning, he told himself. Just to see if it's something simple. He pressed middle C, and the sound that came out was definitely flat. Not terribly, but enough to throw everything else off. David frowned and tried a few more keys, listening carefully to each note. His fingers seemed to remember what to do without permission from his brain. Before he knew it, he was playing a simple scale, testing each note against the others, identifying which keys were causing the problem. The muscle memory was still there, buried under 3 years of maintenance work and single-parent exhaustion. His fingers found their way around the keyboard like they'd never left, and suddenly David was playing more than just scales. The melody came out of nowhere, soft and gentle at first, then growing stronger. It was Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, the piece Rebecca used to ask him to play when she couldn't sleep during those last difficult months. David hadn't played it since the funeral. Hadn't played anything, really. But here it was, flowing out of his fingers like water, filling the empty auditorium with something beautiful and sad and hopeful all at once. He'd forgotten how good it felt to make music, not just to hear it or appreciate it, but to actually create it with his own hands. The piano wasn't perfectly in tune, but somehow that made the music more honest, more real. As he played, David felt something inside his chest loosen, a knot he hadn't even realized was there. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about bills or schedules or whether Lily's lunch was nutritious enough. He was just playing, just being present with the music and letting it say things he didn't have words for. He was so lost in the moment that he didn't notice Mrs. Rodriguez standing in the doorway of the auditorium, her hand pressed to her chest and tears in her eyes. He didn't see the small group of performers who had stopped their packing to listen, drawn by the unexpected beauty echoing through the building. David didn't notice any of it until he played the final. Gentle notes, and the silence that followed felt different than the silence before, deeper, more alive. Only then did he look up and realize he wasn't alone. David's hands jerked away from the keys like he'd been burned. Heat rushed to his face as he realized that Mrs. Rodriguez was standing in the doorway, along with Jake the college student, 2 of the comedy sketch women, and several other performers who should have gone home by now. They were all staring at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Surprise, admiration, pity? David couldn't tell, and that made everything worse. The piano was out of tune, he stammered, standing up so quickly that the bench scraped against the floor. I was checking to see if it was something simple. I didn't mean to... David, Mrs. Rodriguez said softly, walking toward the stage. That was beautiful. It's nothing, David said, already moving away from the piano. I should get back to cleaning up. There's still work to do before tomorrow. But Jake stepped forward, his eyes wide with something that looked like awe. Dude, where did you learn to play like that? I've been studying piano for 8 years and I've never heard anyone play Chopin like that outside of a concert hall. David felt trapped, like a deer caught in headlights. All these people looking at him, expecting answers he didn't want to give. I used to play a little. It's been years. A little? One of the comedy sketch women, Helen, he thought her name was, stepped closer to the stage. Honey, I've been coming to performances here for 15 years and I've never heard anything like what you just played. That wasn't a little, that was professional level. You're the maintenance guy, right? Jake asked, looking confused. I see you here every day setting up equipment and stuff. But that playing, man, that was incredible. David wished the floor would open up and swallow him whole. This was exactly what he'd been afraid of for 3 years. People finding out who he used to be, asking questions he didn't know how to answer. Look, I really need to finish cleaning up, David said, grabbing his cleaning supplies from where he'd left them earlier. The auditorium needs to be perfect for Friday night. But Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't letting him escape that easily. She climbed the steps to the stage, her expression gentle but determined. David, can I ask you something? And please just be honest with me. She paused, studying his face. You're not just a maintenance worker, are you? You have training. Real training. David's shoulders sagged. There was no point in lying now. They'd all heard him play. They knew. I used to teach music, he said quietly, not meeting anyone's eyes. Elementary school. But that was a long time ago. How long ago? Mrs. Rodriguez pressed. 3 years. The words came out barely above a whisper. Jake shook his head in disbelief. 3 years? Dude, you play like you never stopped. Why did you quit teaching? David felt his chest tighten. This was the part of the story he never wanted to tell. The part that made people look at him with those sad, pitying expressions that made him feel like a charity case. It's complicated, he said. David. Mrs. Rodriguez's voice was kind but firm. I've been organizing events here for 12 years. I know talent when I see it. And what you just played wasn't just talent. It was extraordinary. There's a story here, isn't there? In the front row, Lily stirred in her sleep and David glanced over at his daughter. She looked so small, curled up in that big auditorium chair, her backpack clutched against her chest like a security blanket. My wife got sick, David said finally, the words feeling heavy in the quiet space. Cancer. The medical bills were... We needed better insurance, more stable income. Teaching doesn't exactly pay great, and I needed a job where I could bring Lily when necessary. The silence that followed was the kind David hated, full of sympathy and awkwardness, and people not knowing what to say. I'm sorry, Helen said softly. That must have been incredibly difficult. David nodded but didn't trust himself to speak. But David, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice growing excited, you could still teach. You could still perform. What you just played, people need to hear that. No, David said quickly, more sharply than he'd intended. I don't do that anymore. I'm just the maintenance guy now. That's enough. But you could perform in the talent show Friday night, Jake said, his enthusiasm building. The piano will be tuned by then and you could play that Chopin piece or anything really. The audience would lose their minds. Absolutely not. David started backing away from the group, panic rising in his chest. I don't perform. I don't teach. I clean floors and set up chairs and fix broken equipment. That's my job. David, please, Mrs. Rodriguez said. Just think about it. What you have? It's a gift. People don't get to hear music like that very often. I said no. David's voice echoed through the auditorium, louder than he'd meant it to be. In her chair, Lily stirred again but didn't wake up. The group exchanged glances, clearly wanting to say more but sensing that David had reached his limit. Okay, Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. I understand. But David, thank you for fixing the piano, and thank you for letting us hear that beautiful music, even if it was just for a few minutes. One by one, the performers gathered their things and headed for the exits, casting curious glances back at David as they left. Jake lingered the longest, looking like he wanted to say something more, but eventually he too picked up his sheet music and headed out. Mrs. Rodriguez was the last to go. She walked back to the stage one more time and looked up at David, who was standing there feeling exposed and raw. I know you said no, and I respect that, she said. But David, that music that just came out of you, it wasn't just beautiful. It was healing. For all of us who heard it, and I think maybe for you too. After she left, David stood alone on the empty stage, surrounded by silence again. But this silence felt different than before. It felt like the moment after you tell a secret you've been keeping for years. Scary and vulnerable, but somehow lighter too. He looked over at Lily, who was finally starting to wake up, stretching and rubbing her eyes. "Daddy?" she said sleepily. "What happened? Why is everyone gone?" "Just finishing up, sweetheart," David said, walking over to gather her backpack. "Time to go home." As they walked to the car, Lily chattering about the dream she'd just had, David couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted tonight. For 3 years, he'd managed to keep his two worlds separate, the man he used to be and the man he'd become. But now the walls between those worlds had cracks in them, and he wasn't sure if he was strong enough to patch them back up. Later that night, after Lily was tucked into bed and David was washing dishes in their small kitchen, she appeared in the doorway in her pajamas. "Daddy, I heard music tonight," she said, "while I was sleeping. It was really pretty." David's hand stilled on the plate he was washing. "Oh?" It sounded like the music Mommy used to hum sometimes, the sad but happy kind. Lily patted over to him and leaned against his leg. "Was that you playing?" David set the plate down and knelt to her level. His daughter's eyes, Rebecca's eyes, looked at him with the kind of innocent honesty that could break your heart and put it back together at the same time. "Yeah, baby, that was me. I liked it," she said simply. "I miss hearing you play music." And there it was. The truth David had been running from for 3 years, spoken in the matter-of-fact way that only children could manage. "I miss it too," he whispered. Friday night arrived faster than David wanted it to. The community center was packed with families, friends, and neighbors, all settling into their seats for the annual talent show. David had spent the entire day making sure everything was perfect. The lights were positioned just right. The sound system was working flawlessly, and yes, a piano tuner had come that morning to fix every key. David tried to stay busy in the back of the auditorium, checking and rechecking equipment that didn't need checking. But he couldn't escape the nervous energy that had been building in his chest since Wednesday night. Lily sat in the 3rd row, wearing her favorite dress, the purple one with tiny flowers that she'd insisted on for this special occasion. Mrs. Chen, their neighbor, had offered to stay with Lily during the show so David could work, but Lily had begged to come watch. "I want to see all the people perform, Daddy," she'd said that morning. "Maybe someone will play piano like you did." David had managed to smile and told her maybe, but inside he'd been hoping desperately that no one would mention Wednesday night's incident. He'd spent the past 2 days pretending it never happened, throwing himself into his work and avoiding eye contact with Mrs. Rodriguez whenever possible. But as the performers gathered backstage, David couldn't help noticing their excitement. The teenage boy with his guitar looked nervous but determined. The comedy sketch women were running through their lines one last time. Jake paced back and forth, his sheet music clutched in his hands, looking much more confident now that the piano was properly tuned. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Lincoln Community Center's annual talent show." Mrs. Rodriguez's voice boomed through the sound system, and the audience erupted in applause. David positioned himself at his usual spot along the side wall, ready to handle any technical issues that might arise. From here he could see everything: the performers waiting their turn backstage, the audience leaning forward in anticipation, and Lily sitting up straight in her seat, eyes wide with excitement. The show began, and David found himself getting caught up in it despite his best efforts to stay detached. Each performer brought something unique to the stage. A group of teenagers did a dance routine that had everyone clapping along. An elderly man told jokes that made the whole auditorium laugh. A young woman sang a song she'd written about her hometown, but it was Jake's performance that really got to David. When the college student sat down at the newly tuned piano and began playing his classical piece, the difference was incredible. What had sounded muddy and uncertain during Wednesday's rehearsal now rang out clear and beautiful. Jake's fingers moved across the keys with confidence, and his music filled every corner of the auditorium. David watched from the shadows as Jake finished to thunderous applause, and he felt a pang of something he couldn't quite name: jealousy, regret, longing. As the show continued, David noticed Mrs. Rodriguez glancing in his direction several times. There was something in her expression that made him nervous, like she was planning something he wouldn't like. His suspicions were confirmed when she returned to the microphone after the last scheduled performer took their bow. Before we wrap up tonight's show, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice carrying across the packed auditorium, I want to share something special with all of you. David's stomach dropped. No, she wouldn't. She couldn't. This week, we discovered that we have an incredible talent right here among us, someone who's been working behind the scenes for years, making sure our events run smoothly, but who has his own gift to share. The audience murmured with curiosity, craning their necks to see what was happening. David started backing toward the exit, but Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes found his and held them. David Thompson has been our maintenance supervisor for 3 years, she continued. But what many of you don't know is that he's also a trained musician and former music teacher. Earlier this week, we had the privilege of hearing him play, and I can honestly say it was one of the most beautiful performances I've ever witnessed. The audience turned to look for David, and he felt like every eye in the room was searching for him. His face burned with embarrassment and something close to panic. So, David, Mrs. Rodriguez said, her voice gentle but carrying clearly through the microphone, would you consider sharing your gift with us tonight? The auditorium fell silent. David could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. This was his worst nightmare. Being put on the spot, everyone staring, everyone waiting for him to be something he'd convinced himself he wasn't anymore. He shook his head, trying to signal to Mrs. Rodriguez that this wasn't happening. But then he caught sight of Lily in the third row. She had turned around like everyone else looking for him. When their eyes met, her face lit up with an expression of pure excitement and pride. She was nodding enthusiastically, bouncing a little in her seat. That's my daddy, she called out, pointing in his direction. He plays the most beautiful music in the whole world. A ripple of warm laughter went through the audience. And suddenly David felt every person in that room looking at him with curiosity and encouragement, rather than judgment. Jake stood up from where he'd been sitting with the other performers and started clapping. Come on, David. You've got to play for everyone. Soon other people were clapping too, and then the whole auditorium was applauding, not for a performance they'd heard, but for one they were hoping to hear. David found himself walking toward the stage before he'd consciously decided to move. His legs felt shaky and his mouth was dry, but something was pulling him forward. As he climbed the steps to the stage, the applause grew louder. Mrs. Rodriguez handed him the microphone, but David just shook his head and handed it back. He didn't have words for this moment. He only had music. The piano bench felt familiar under his hands as he adjusted it to the right height. The keys gleamed under the stage lights, and David could see his reflection in their polished surface. For a moment, he sat there in the silence, overwhelmed by the weight of 200 people watching him, waiting for him to be brave enough to share the part of himself he'd kept locked away. Then he looked out into the audience and found Lily's face. She was leaning forward, her hands clasped together, looking at him with absolute faith that he would create something beautiful. David's fingers found the keys, and the first notes of Chopin's Nocturne filled the auditorium. But this time it sounded different than it had on Wednesday night. The piano was perfectly tuned now, and every note rang out exactly as it should. As he played, David felt something shifting inside him. The fear and embarrassment began to fade, replaced by something he'd almost forgotten, the pure joy of making music. His fingers moved across the keys with growing confidence, and the melody flowed out of him like it had been waiting years to be set free. He played the Chopin piece through to its gentle ending, then found himself moving seamlessly into Clair de Lune, the piece he used to play for Lily when she was a baby and couldn't sleep. The music seemed to choose itself, each piece flowing into the next as David let himself remember who he used to be. Finally, he played something he'd never performed for anyone before, a melody he'd written for Rebecca during her last weeks, when words weren't enough to say what he felt. It was sad and hopeful at the same time, full of love and loss and the kind of beauty that comes from surviving something that almost breaks you. When the last note faded away, the silence that followed was different from any silence David had ever experienced. It was full and rich and alive, like the whole auditorium was holding its breath. Then the applause began, and it didn't stop. The applause went on for what felt like forever. David sat at the piano bench, overwhelmed by the sound of 200 people showing their appreciation for something he'd almost convinced himself didn't matter anymore. When he finally stood up and turned toward the audience, the clapping grew even louder. People were on their feet, some wiping tears from their eyes, others calling out compliments he couldn't quite make out over the noise. But the only face he was looking for was Lily's. She was jumping up and down in her seat, clapping so hard, her hands must have hurt, with the biggest smile he'd ever seen on her face. "That's my daddy," she shouted again, and this time everyone around her laughed and clapped even harder. Mrs. Rodriguez appeared at his side, her own eyes shiny with tears. She didn't say anything, just squeezed his shoulder and handed him the microphone. David looked out at the crowd, still not sure he had words for what had just happened, but he knew he needed to try. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. I haven't played for anyone in a very long time. I'd forgotten how good it feels to share music with people." He paused, finding Lily in the crowd again. "My daughter told me this week that she missed hearing me play. I didn't realize how much I missed it too until tonight." The audience gave him another warm round of applause, and David handed the microphone back to Mrs. Rodriguez, feeling lighter than he had in years. As people started filing out of the auditorium, David was surprised by how many stopped to talk to him. Jake pumped his hand enthusiastically, telling him he'd never heard anything like it. Helen, from the comedy sketch group, hugged him and said his music had given her chills. Parents thanked him for the beautiful performance, and several people asked if he gave piano lessons. "Piano lessons?" David repeated to the third person who asked. The idea hadn't even occurred to him. "My daughter's been wanting to learn," said a woman named Patricia, gesturing to a girl about Lily's age. "After hearing you play tonight, I think she'd be inspired to work with a teacher who has your kind of talent." By the time the crowd thinned out, David had 5 parents asking about lessons and 2 people wondering if he'd be willing to play at their upcoming events. Lily ran up to him as soon as she could get through the crowd, practically bouncing with excitement. "Daddy, that was amazing." Everyone was crying happy tears, and Mrs. Chen said you made her think of her grandmother, and Katie's mom wants to know if you can teach Katie piano, and David scooped her up in a hug, cutting off her stream of excited chatter. "Did you like it, sweetheart?" "I loved it," she said, wrapping her arms around his neck. "It made me feel like Mommy was listening too." David's throat tightened. "Yeah, baby." I think she was. Over the next few weeks, David's life started changing in ways he'd never expected. Word about his performance spread through the community, and soon his phone was ringing with requests for lessons, performance opportunities, and even a part-time teaching position at the local music school. At first, he was hesitant. His maintenance job was secure, and he'd gotten used to the safety of not putting himself out there. But every time he was tempted to say no to an opportunity, he remembered how it had felt to play for that audience, and how proud Lily had looked in the front row. He started small. Saturday morning piano lessons in his living room for 3 kids whose parents had been at the talent show. The old upright piano that had sat silent in their apartment for 3 years suddenly came back to life, filled with the sounds of beginner scales and simple melodies. Lily loved having the other kids over. She'd do her homework at the kitchen table while David taught, occasionally looking up to offer encouraging comments to his students. "Don't worry about messing up," she told one frustrated boy. "My daddy says mistakes are just practice in disguise." Within a month, David had 8 regular students. Within 2 months, the local music school offered him a part-time position, teaching their intermediate students. The pay wasn't huge, but it was enough to let him cut back his maintenance hours at the community center to part-time. Mrs. Rodriguez was nothing but supportive when David asked about reducing his schedule. "I've been hoping you'd find your way back to music," she said. "You can keep your office here, and we'll still need you for events and maintenance. But David, watching you come alive on that stage, that's what you were meant to do." 6 months after the talent show, David found himself standing on the same stage where everything had changed. This time, it was for the community center's anniversary celebration, and he was the featured performer, rather than the maintenance guy who'd stumbled into the spotlight. Lily sat in the front row again, but this time she wasn't alone. His piano students were there with their families, along with many of the faces from that first night. Jake was there too, having become one of David's adult students after graduation. As David began to play, a mix of classical pieces and some of his own compositions. He marveled at how different his life looked now. He was still a single father, still working hard to provide for Lily, but he wasn't hiding anymore. His small apartment now echoed with music most days. Students came and went, filling the space with laughter and the sounds of learning. Lily had started taking lessons herself, showing a natural aptitude that reminded David so much of Rebecca, it sometimes took his breath away. "She has your ear for music, Mrs. Shen had said one afternoon, listening to Lily practice a simple piece with remarkable sensitivity for a 7-year-old. "She has her mother's heart for it," David had replied, and realized it was the first time in years he'd mentioned Rebecca without feeling that familiar stab of pain. After the anniversary performance, as people crowded around to congratulate him, David spotted a familiar face in the audience. It was Mr. Peterson, the principal from Roosevelt Elementary, where he used to teach. "David," the older man said, making his way through the crowd, "I had no idea you were still in town. That performance was incredible." They chatted for a few minutes, catching up on the years that had passed. Then Mr. Peterson said something that made David's heart skip. "We've been looking for a new music teacher at Roosevelt. Our current teacher is retiring next year. I don't suppose you'd be interested in coming back?" David looked out at the auditorium, at all the people who'd supported him on this unexpected journey back to music. Then he looked at Lily, who was showing off her own piano skills to a group of impressed adults. "Can I think about it?" David asked. "Of course," Mr. Peterson said. "But David, don't think too long. Some opportunities don't come around twice." That night, as David tucked Lily into bed, she looked up at him with serious eyes. "Daddy, do you think you'll go back to teaching at a school?" "Would you want me to?" David asked. Lily considered this carefully. "I think other kids should get to learn music from you. You make it sound like magic." David smiled and kissed her forehead. "We'll see, sweetheart. But whatever happens, we'll figure it out together." As he turned off her light and headed to his own room, David caught sight of the framed photo on his nightstand. Him, Rebecca, and baby Lily at the piano in their old house. For the first time in years, looking at it didn't hurt. Instead, it felt like a reminder of all the good things that were still possible. Tomorrow, he'd call Mr. Peterson and say yes to the teaching position. Tonight, he'd sit at his piano and play whatever came to him, grateful for the second chance he'd almost been too scared to take.